Okay, hopefully that will have sorted it out. Um, so, um, Thank you very much for those people who've succeeded in joining. I need to make clear that although it's the local Green Party that's organised this talk, Tracey is not talking on behalf of the Green Party. Having heard Tracey talk, Green Party members have been very impressed with her level of knowledge and her concerns about these Southern Water proposals. But these are our personal opinions, and we hope this talk will help you to make up your own minds about the issue. The talk will take about an hour, but this will fly by because there is so much to discover. We're going to keep all the questions to the end, so please make a note of your questions during the talk. If you raise your hand, your virtual hand at the end of the talk, I will try and take your questions in the order that they come in. You may have a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or you may find that you have to use the react button first. We're asking you to please keep yourselves muted, and if we find there are connection problems, we will also ask you to switch off your screens. So I'm really pleased to have Tracey Viney talk to us this evening. Tracey worked for both the Portsmouth Water and for the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and she has an in-depth understanding of all aspects of water provision, as well as some very practical experience of delivering it. At the moment, Southern Water is consulting on their water rescue management plan, and the deadline is December the 4th. We hope this talk will help you to respond to this consultation. Effluent water recycling is a key part of their plan, and Tracey will include the schemes of Littlehampton and the Isle of Wight and Horsham in this talk, but her main example will be Havant and the new Havant reservoir. So it's with great pleasure I'll now hand you over to Tracey.
Thanks very much, Anne. Just to give you a bit more about my background's primarily in environmental regulation. Initially, when I began my career setting up seawater and other environmental monitoring programs. And then I spent 15 years specialising in identifying and cleaning up contaminated land, which is also relevant to the discussion today. I then moved on to work for the Drinking Water Inspectorate, where amongst my other roles, I was the company policeman for Southern Water and Portsmouth Water, responsible for auditing their sites, incidents and complaints. And then I moved on to become the Portsmouth Water project manager for the development of the Havant Thicket Reservoir. So a project that I'm very passionate about. And I finally retired in 2020 and have kept a keen interest. I'm still a stakeholder on the reservoir groups and commenting on planning applications and things. Was a bit horrified to find out the plans for effluent recycling. We're going to go there. So talk for about an hour. I take questions at the end, more than happy to do that. And I'm here tonight to give you a briefing to help you understand more about the effluent recycling schemes proposed by Southern Water, the concerns about those schemes, and to look at whether there are perhaps more sustainable options that we should be considering. So the Southern Water Plan was first consulted on in 2022 with responses required around 2023. DEFRA then rejected that plan and asked them to go away and look at alternative options. But unfortunately, they've sort of recycled the same plan. And we'll talk about that a bit later. The plan includes 4 new energy and carbon hungry effluent recycling plants, Havant, Horsham, Littlehampton and Sandown, timescales for each being slightly different. This is the final effluent from the existing sewage works that's being treated, which would normally be discharged into the environment, which will now be treated further and discharged into environmental buffers, which means either a local river or a reservoir. And until Southern Water are able to bring on the Hampshire scheme, the proposal is now to fill the gap by bringing in sea tankers from Norway in a drought. A bit more background, they're currently losing about 19% of the water that we, the customers, pay to treat and put into their network. 19% of that is being lost in the distribution network, and about 3% before it even reaches the treatment plant. In the UK, we're only capturing about 1% of rainwater that comes down. And the key question here is, why can't we capture more like they do in other countries? Our population is growing, so we do recognise the need to change the way that we extract water and protect the environment. But the question is, are Southern Water taking us down the wrong path? So during the talk, we'll look at some of the concerns with their plan and hopefully some suggestions for a better way forward. So here we'll start off with just describing each of the schemes. So this is the Littlehampton Effluent Recycling Scheme. So you've got at the bottom here, you can see my cursor, this sort of big red triangle is indicative of the rough area south of Arundel, where the sewage works is, and the new recycling plant will go close to the sewage works. There'll then be a pipeline across the South Downs. So just, oh, sorry, just put that back. Across the South Downs, so from the sewage works, somewhere up here to the Western Rother. Now, we're not exactly sure where in the Western Rother. The Western Rother goes right down past Midhurst, so it could be this far away, but indicatively Western Rother around this area, with that being used as the environmental buffer. So the treated water that comes from the effluent recycling plant discharged into the effluent Rother, where it mixes with the existing water in the Rother, which is currently classified as having poor ecological status. It then flows down the river, which you can see on the right-hand side of your picture here, where my little arrow is, where there's a treatment works for drinking water, where the water is abstracted, and they've not yet decided whether it will be upstream or downstream of that treatment works in the information that they provide. The reject water, which we'll talk about later, will be discharged to sea via the existing long sea outfall, and that will have a fourfold increase in concentration of the products from the sewage effluent in it. And that's scheduled to be operational by 2030 or 31. There's also another scheme which also ends up at the Pulborough Water Treatment Works, which is the Horsham Effluent Recycling Scheme. So that takes the water from the sort of red trapezium area near Horsham. It's a 9.5 million litre plant, so that's about 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools, nearly 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools, if you can think back to the swimming pool in the Olympics. And that water is going to be transferred by pipeline to a reservoir, a small reservoir near Pulborough. So you can see that Pulborough is down in the left-hand side of that map down here. So across this sort of area here, there's going to be a long pipeline going through the countryside, which obviously will have its environmental effects. And that's scheduled to be operational by 2072. And because it's going into a reservoir, obviously there'll be some losses. So they've been allowed for giving 6.8 megalitres in the final water. So the existing sewage works at Horsham discharges into the River Arun. They haven't said where the reject water from the effluent recycling plant will go. But hopefully it's not proposed to go into the River Arun. So there's also a proposal on the Isle of Wight at Sandown for an effluent recycling scheme. So the sewage works will be from Sandown, again, roughly where the red trapezoid is there. The water recycling plant will be alongside that works, and it will be constructed partially on an old landfill site, which is in the floodplain. And we'll come back to the problems with the Havant scheme and the development on a landfill site there. And obviously people on the Isle of Wight will need to consider that very carefully when they're considering this scheme. The pipeline will discharge 8.5 megalitres, so that's over 3 Olympic swimming pools of water into the Eastern Yar, which is quite a small scheme, where it will dilute with the fresh water as an environmental buffer and then flow downstream towards Brading Marshes. The water will be re-abstracted from the river close to an existing water supply works, and the reject water from that, the concentrated reject water from the plant, will go into the existing Sandown long sea outfall. And the proposal is that plant will be operational by 2030 or 31. They've already flagged that they're going to need to do a full environmental impact assessment for this scheme to consider the investigation of the landfill site and the risks with that, and also the risks to the river with Brading Marshes RSPB reserve downstream. So that's something to think about as well. So Sewage works, each of these schemes obviously requires a sewage works to supply the final effluent, but it is the final effluent that comes out of the works, the treated effluent, that is being used for these recycling schemes, not the raw sewage. But what goes into the works is still relevant to the risks from the scheme. So for each of your schemes, you need to think about what's the catchment area for the works. Is that large, small? How much industrial activity is in there? What sorts of industrial activity? So if we look at the Budds Farm sewage works, which is the one that will be used for the Hampshire scheme, the input of commercial and industrial waste is about 16% of the raw water flow into the works. And that obviously comes from industrial areas around Havant and Portsmouth and other areas as well. And that includes things like silver and nickel plating works, engineering works, and you can just imagine there's all sorts of boat building and other activities which are discharging to the sewer, which we need to consider about whether the recycling plant is going to remove all of those risks from the final water. You also need to think about whether or not there's additional tankered waste. So certainly in Hampshire, the Budds Farm works takes an awful lot of tankered waste. Some of it comes from other sewage works, other of it comes from industrial sources. So we need to understand what's in the tankered waste and what effect that has on the risk assessment. We need to think about in the longer term, is the water quality going to deteriorate if there's more development, more housing, more industry? Is the works water quality going to deteriorate? And the answer for that for our Budds Farm Hampshire works is that a Southern Water report confirmed that it was going to deteriorate. So that's important to consider. And for any of the works that are on the coast, so that would apply to Sandown, the Hampshire scheme, and also the Isle of Wight scheme, is there saline intrusion into the sewers where they're on the coast? The works doesn't have to be right on the coast to experience saline intrusion from the sewage in the pipework that passes along the coast going into the works, because if they do, this reverse osmosis plant isn't a full desalination plant, so it doesn't remove all of the salt from the water. Some of it gets through, and in Hampshire, that means that the original scheme, which was to recycle final effluent from Budds Farm and discharge it into the River Itchen, has been rejected because the Environment Agency and Natural England won't accept it going into the River Itchen. So whether that's just because of the saline intrusion or other concerns about sort of geochemistry and pollution, we haven't really got a definitive answer on, but certainly saline intrusion is a part of that problem to consider. In other countries where they've had effluent recycling in drought-stricken countries, it tends to be in relatively small catchments, not necessarily big urban catchments, and they do make an effort to reduce the risks in the catchment before they bring in effluent recycling. So we asked Southern Water about that, and they said they've got no plans to identify and improve the management of risks in their sewage catchment. They're just going to rely on existing controls, and you might be aware that that includes things like grandparent rights for industries that have been around a long time, who have very old-fashioned controls on their licenses. We've also done some research with colleagues into the effectiveness of sewage works in the local area. And certainly for the Budds Farm works, that shows that the effectiveness of the main sewage works is actually quite different depending on the flow conditions. So in dry conditions, it might be about 80% effective at removing some of the contaminants in the sewage, such as ammonia. But during wet weather, the efficiency of the treatment works actually reduces quite significantly to about 46% as a worst case. So the actual flow that's coming out of the sewage works in terms of its final effluent could be quite variable. And that's of concern because the Southern Water specialist previously advised us that the effluent recycling treatment process needs a fairly consistent water quality stream for the treatment to be most effective. So the question is, can the sewage works that's going to deliver this final effluent actually deliver that consistency? And a final thing to remember is even with robust advanced treatment of the final effluent, not all of the contaminants removed. It does depend on the contaminant. All of them are to remove to some extent, but there are some residual contaminants left in the water. So if we just have a quick look at the treatment process and start on the left-hand side with the red box. This is the example from Hampshire, but it would actually apply to any of those schemes that we've just been talking about because the advanced treatment process applies to all of them. So we have the final effluent coming in from the sewage works. Well, that, if you look at final effluent, looks like a fairly clean water, but it's still got brown floaty bits in it. So that has to go through a microfiltration phase to remove the larger particles to protect the reverse osmosis membranes, because it then passes on into the reverse osmosis plant, which is put under immense pressure to sort of force the water to go through sort of micro straws to actually remove the contaminants. So only cleaner water is actually forced through into the straws. Southern water indicate this will remove metals, nitrates, ammonia salts, minerals, pharmaceuticals, and bacteria, but not 100% of all of that material is removed. And they have to add things like acids and antiscalants to prevent the fouling of the membranes because they're so fine. Obviously, they're very, very easily fouled. And that's where the consistency of the water quality coming into the plant is important. And we know, for example, from experience at Thames that they've had real problems with their maintaining their membranes and the membranes actually breaking down, which has made them very difficult to maintain and very costly, which is one thing for a desalination plant, but obviously that's a significant issue to think about in relation to effluent recycling. From the reverse osmosis plant, it goes up into advanced oxidation. So this is where the water is exposed to ultraviolet light, which helps to break down some of the other sort of bacteria and things that are in the water that have got through the process to this stage. But also it's dosed with hydrogen peroxide so that all the oxidizable constituents, including things like pesticides, can actually be removed. Again, not necessarily 100% removal, but certainly a massive amount of them is removed. At that point, we get remineralization because having gone through this fairly advanced treatment process, a lot of the minerals are actually taken out of the water. And so the water is actually quite corrosive to pipes and things and wouldn't be suitable to provide drinking water. So they remineralize it with calcium and magnesium salts that were removed from earlier stages. There's then a proposal to add on activated carbon to try and remove excess hydrogen peroxide. But that is also indicated to remove some of the remaining residual organics. From there, it goes into the environmental buffer. So in this case, it's the Havant Thicket Reservoir, but it might also be the river. If, for example, you're looking at one of the other cases like the Isle of Wight, for example. From that, the environmental buffer, it then goes into a treatment works. So in the Hampshire case, it goes into Portsmouth Waters, Farlington Treatment Works, and is supplied across the Portsmouth Water supply area. And for Southern Water, it will go via a 40-kilometre pipeline to Otterbourne, where the water will be received every day, and also more water will be received in a drought. So using the Hampshire scheme, which I know best as an example, this scheme requires a huge amount of new infrastructure. So there's a massive carbon impact. If we just find my cursor again, down here we have the water recycling plant, which is on the coast between Havant and Portsmouth. Then we have the pipelines that will take the water up to the reservoir, and this is the Havant Thicket Reservoir here. And then we've got the 40-kilometre pipeline all the way to Otterbourne, where the water goes out into the supply. You'll notice there's no indication on this map from Southern Water's consultation documents that actually the water is also going out in the whole of the Portsmouth Water supply area, particularly initially in an emergency or drought when the reservoir's used, but from 2014 more routinely when Portsmouth Water need to use the reservoir. And it's also missing another pipe that is planned to come from the reservoir across to Pulborough, another 30-kilometre pipe, which is expected to be in place by 2040 to provide additional supplies from the reservoir with mixed recycled effluent across to the West Sussex area. So this is pretty much going to the whole of South Hampshire, the whole of the Portsmouth Water supply area, and also across to Sussex. And parts of Sussex will also get it from the Portsmouth Water supply area, which goes across to Chichester. So we've got a large water recycling plant, 3 new pumping stations in Havant, 2 new pipelines to Bud's Farm to carry the sewage and the reject water, the sewage effluent, sorry, and the reject water, and 2 pipelines to carry the water from the recycling plant to Bedhampton Springs, where they hope to link it up with some Portsmouth Water pipelines to take it up to the reservoir. In addition to that, there's another 3 pumping stations and 2 break pressure tanks to get the water all the way to Otterbourne, because it won't get there all the way on its own. And the company, to remember, Ofwat allowed the company to make a profit out of building infrastructure, because when the industry was privatised, they were really keen that the key reason for doing that was to actually get investment in the water industry infrastructure. And that's why the water companies are allowed to make a profit out of these infrastructure schemes, whereas they're not allowed to make a profit out of maintenance, like fixing leaks and repairing mains. So this was supposed to be a drought resource, but to keep the pipelines and the plant, what they call sweet and operating efficiently, they have to put 30 megalitres a day through the system every day of the year, even when it's not a drought. So that's about 12 Olympic-sized swimming pools that need to be treated and pumped all the way to Otterbourne every day of the year. And that, for me, is what really makes this a very unsustainable scheme, because the chemicals, energy and carbon that are needed for something which was selected as a drought resource to be operated 365 days a year for the next 60 years is really of concern. So what the environmental buffer in this case is the Havant Thicket Reservoir, and particular concerns for this environmental buffer is that it was going to be a unique biodiversity opportunity to create the first chalk spring fed reservoir that we could find anywhere in the world. So obviously by putting the recycled water into it, which will have different geochemical properties, that potentially changes the reservoir very substantially, especially in a drought when you've got larger volumes of recycled water going in and big quantities of water coming out. There's no plan to remineralise the input to that of a chalk spring, which is something that they could do, but they've indicated they're not planning to. We need to be worried about the significant change in water composition. We talked about the salinity from the coast going into the raw treatment works, the raw sewage works, and that actually does get through, to a certain extent, the effluent recycling process. So we know the salinity will be higher when it goes into the reservoir. Temperature will be higher because it's gone through this process. Spring water is quite cold. Generally fairly constant temperature. This water will be quite warm, so they need to consider the sort of temperature impacts and what impact that might have on ecology and things like algal blooms. And obviously the general geochemistry, as we've mentioned, will be quite different to the spring water. We're also very worried about the pollution risk. What if something goes wrong or the plant's not properly maintained? Southern Water have been in the papers again this week, but I think it was a £360,000 fine for an incident in South Hampshire where they didn't respond quickly to a plant failure, and there were thousands of fish killed in a river, and it took them 20 hours to respond to that. Well, this is the sort of behaviour that isn't acceptable when you're dealing with effluent recycling, because obviously the plant needs to be fully effectively managed and maintained at all times. And there's a big concern in the local group that I work with about mistrust in Southern Water because of their record of prosecutions. The impact on ecology, not only in the reservoir, but also in the Hermitage stream. The reservoir has an overflow which basically runs through the Hermitage stream and down into Langstone Harbour. So, you know, the water quality modelling hasn't yet been published or completed in relation to what's going to be the impact on the reservoir or the downstream river in terms of the compensation flow. We've already talked about the fact that the effluent recycling plant doesn't take out all of the contaminants. There are small residual amounts left. So is there a risk in the reservoir where you've got a fairly confined water body of bioaccumulation in animals and plants, and also accumulation in the sediments, which if you get wave action whipped up by storms could be remobilised and then have an impact on the ecology. One of the things that was really important when I was at Portsmouth Water in terms of getting in Natural England and the Environment Agency and even the local planning authority on board with the reservoir, where there was going to be the loss of 12.5 hectares of ancient woodland, was the promise of nitrate benefits to Langstone Harbour. So the spring water that comes out at Havant and Bedhampton Springs is actually relatively high in nitrates. It's still within the drinking water standard and safe to drink, but it does contribute to the algal blooms that take place in the harbours. And we were able to demonstrate through the modelling that by taking large amounts of water from the springs and pumping them up to the reservoir, that there would be natural breakdown of nitrates in the reservoir, so that by the time it came back down to the harbour, the actual nitrate levels would be lower, and therefore there was a definitive benefit that could be demonstrated. Well, if you keep the reservoir topped up all of the time with recycled water, in the autumn and winter, you don't have to top it up with spring water, and all that spring water will then flow out into the harbour. So will the promised benefits actually be delivered under the operating regimes that are proposed. And how will the reservoir ecology cope in a drought when you've got 24 Olympic-sized swimming pools of recycled effluent going into the reservoir and 36 coming out of a confined water body? So that's a serious concern. And we also challenge whether or not there would be independent monitoring, because the reservoir is actually owned and operated by Portsmouth Water. But Portsmouth Water have told us they're going to rely on Southern Water analysis and maintenance of their analysers, which they don't have a great track record on, and they'll just have a tap facility to sample if they want to. So they'll see the live monitoring data from Southern Water, but effectively it's going to be a self-policing system. We mentioned briefly the risks to Langstone Harbour. Just to orientate you from sort of further afield, the road coming in with the big roundabout at the top of the map is the A3M. So that's in this area. This is the A27 passing through Havant. This is Langstone Harbour here, with Follington Marshes over here. So this is the Broad Marsh Country Park as it is at the moment. And this is the area, the yellow box, where Southern Water plan to put the effluent recycling plant. And to the right here, you can see the Bud Farm sewage works, which will be the raw source of water. So the final effluent from here will come across to this works. So this area here used to be part of the coast, and I'll show you a historic map in a minute. It was tipped on the dilute and disperse principle in the 1960s to the 1980s. So before the 1974 Control of Pollution Act, this landfill site was already being operated. So there's no lining. They were literally just sort of end tipping over onto the muds of the harbour. So it took domestic, commercial, and industrial waste. It also took incinerator ash from a big incinerator that was alongside at the time. The investigation logs show it contains solvents and hydrocarbons, which are easily mobilised in groundwater and are a significant concern here, given the proximity to the coast. There's a significant risk here because there are a large number of buildings and tanks and other structures that need to be built for an effluent recycling plant of this size, taking 30 megalitres a day and up to 60 megalitres in a drought. So those hundreds of piles will have to pile through the landfill into the underlying chalk aquifer, which is in continuity with the harbour. The water levels go up and down with the tides. And so if they open up new plug holes with piles through the landfill, there's a significantly increased risk to Langstone Harbour, and the flow of the groundwater is to the south towards the harbour. So I think that coming from a contaminated land, very experienced landfill investigation background, I don't see how there's any way that they can seal those piles, because there's nothing to seal them into. And it's worth bearing in mind on the Isle of Wight that they've also got an old landfill in the floodplain. So this is something that needs to be considered in that area. For those of you that know the area, you might know that this area around here is actually very heavily used by birds. It's part of the special protection area. So it's used particularly by gulls and waders, but also you see brent geese feeding, particularly where you've got the sort of salt marsh grasses and things. Now, normally what you do if you're constructing on the coast is you avoid constructing during the sort of autumn winter period when the high levels of birds are here from the Arctic. But because construction of this plant will take place over 2 to 3 years, that's not something that they're going to have to do. So I think, when they're banging in hundreds of piles and things, this is going to have an impact on the SPA, and it's very difficult to assess what that impact might be. So just to go back to that previous slide, if you look at where the current Hermitage stream is, so the reservoir's way up here and the stream flows down here, then you can see you've got very much a man-made dredged channel here, and this is heavily armoured with concrete armouring, and that's because it's not actually the natural route of the stream here. The stream was rerouted as part of the landfilling. So if we move on to the next map, the existing stream now flows down this side of the red box where the new recycling plant's going to be, and you can see the old stream used to flow through the middle of the site down to where this blue arrow is. And so that stream channel is still there sitting under the landfill, along with all the other salt marsh channels and things that would have existed on the original muds. And that was just end tipped. And so those pathways for migration into the harbour are still looking there. Now, they may have become stabilised to a certain extent because they've been there with the landfill on top for a long time. But if you start piling through that material, the risk of you opening up pathways is really, really significant. So this is a sort of an artist's impression from Southern Water's consultation documents that show you the Buds Farm treatment works on the right here and the huge development, which will be the water recycling plant for Southern Water. And you can see you've got massive buildings, lots of ancillary buildings, lots of chemical tanks, other storage facilities here for the chemicals and things that they're going to store. So you can just imagine each of those buildings are sitting on a landfill that's up to 13 metres deep, are going to need huge piles in order to ensure that they stay where they're intended to be and don't settle. So the piling risk is really quite massive. And I say the groundwater flow is actually towards Langstone Harbour. And then over on the right here, we've got these two red lines. So one of these pipes will carry the water from the Buds Farm final effluent across to the works. And then the second one will carry the reject water back to the Longsea outfall. And you can see that this will require pipes to be tunnelled under the Hermitage stream. And that opens up a new risk, not only while they're actually constructing it and an additional risk to the SPA, but also it gives us a risk of future bursts from the reject water, which is very concentrated with the nasties actually from the effluent recycling plant. And then you can see at the top here, we've got two brown pipelines. So they've got to go in 12-metre wide shafts down through the landfill into the chalk to find some solid ground to then be taken over to the Bedhampton Springs or directly up to the reservoir if they can't get permission to use the Portsmouth water pipelines. So again, high risk of opening up pathways here with the shafts that are dug through the landfill. And then the green pipes that are on the left, that's two pipes, again, with 12-metre wide shafts going down into the landfill, through into the chalk, with the pipes being having to rise 90 metres to the top of Portsdown Hill before they can start to fall away for the 40-kilometre route down to Otterbourne. So just think about the energy and carbon that's going to be needed 365 days a year to pump 30 megalitres 12 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water up to the top of Portsdown Hill and across to Otterbourne near Winchester. These are significant risks. And it's for this reason that 41% of people didn't support the selection of this site. There are alternative sites in the area. Southern Water have dismissed them. The assessment that's in the public domain for the dismissal of those sites is very vague, and we don't think that this is the best site where the water recycling plant should be located. So if it is going to go ahead, it's really important that it isn't put on this site. And we can go on to the risk to the solent from the reject water. And again, this will apply to several of the schemes. For example, the Littlehampton and Sandown schemes will both have the reject water pass out through their Longsea outfall. And for every 80 megalitres that goes through the plant, 20 megalitres is rejected with all of the concentrated materials that have been taken out by the treatment process. So it'll actually be 4 times concentrated with the addition of chemicals from the treatment process as well that will be going to the Longsea outfalls to be discharged to the Solent. And in this case for Havant, that's a 5.7 kilometre outfall out into the Solent, more than halfway across towards the Isle of Wight. The brine will be warm again from the treatment process, so there's a potential for that to have impact along with the contaminants. And the modelling that Southern Water have already hasn't been published, but they have confirmed in their preliminary environmental information report that there will be likely significant effects from the discharge of the concentrated reject water on the Solent. And they're now doing further modelling to assess what mitigation might be needed. But, it's the same sewage effectively that would have been discharged through the Longsea outfall originally from the final effluent of the treatment works, but much, much more concentrated now. Now that becomes a much more pronounced effect in a drought because the majority of the sewage effluent from the Buds Farm works will be being transferred across to the water recycling plant in a drought. So there won't be much other water going down the Longsea outfall. So you will increase your reject water enormously by increasing the rate of flow through the processing works. And so the reject water will actually be more volume, still with this 4-fold concentration and very little dilution in the Longsea outfall when it actually discharges out. So that's something they have to consider in the modelling. The other thing that they need to consider is that this is going out to where into the Solent from the Eastney Buds Farm Longsea outfall, but there's also a Sandown Longsea outfall which will be receiving more concentrated waste, and there's also the Peel Common and Ryde Longsea outfalls, all of these discharging into the central channel in the Solent. And when I move on to the next slide, I'll show you what the impact of just one of those is on the Solent. There's also a concentrated waste that's produced off the back of the filters of this recycling process. Southern Water haven't said exactly where that water is going to go, but there is a suggestion that it's normally returned to the sewage works from where it came. And if that's the case, again, we need to consider the impacts on the works treatment process, and the final discharge to the environment must be considered and modelled from what happens with that concentrated waste. So here's a discharge that's coming out of the existing Longsea outfall, looking at E. coli that moves over a 72-hour multiple tidal cycle. So top left, the discharge is in the middle of that sort of red blob there. That's where the effluent comes out. And you can see initially the red is very concentrated, going down through yellow and green to a pale blue being least concentrated. And you can see that by the time you go through that 72-hour cycle, it actually mills around in the central Solent for quite a long time. It then starts to go into Chichester Harbour. It then comes out of Chichester Harbour and then goes back into Chichester Harbour again. And then if you add on top of that what's happening at Peel Common and what's happening at Sandown, then obviously trying to look at the in-combination effects of all of those is really important. So what's the Hampshire scheme going to cost? It's currently estimated at £1.2 billion as a minimum. That's not including the construction costs for the reservoir, which is a separate project. And those costs are spiralling. They've gone up by millions in just 1 year since the last consultation. And that's going to cost Southern Water customers about £30 per year on their bills, not counting what they're already paying extra for the reservoir, and not counting what they're going to have to pay for all the sewage schemes and things that the government are now committing them to providing. So these are significant costs that customers are going to have to pick up. And just to give you an idea of the costs, the Havant Thicket Reservoir is going to cost about £350 million based on this year's costings. So you could actually get 3 Havant Thicket reservoirs for the same price as you could get 1 Hampshire effluent recycling scheme. And I think an important thing to think about here is legacy as well. So Southern Water have said these recycling plants might last about 60 years. And at the end of 60 years, there's no lasting legacy. The plant becomes redundant or needs to be completely refitted. Whereas if you were to select something like a winter storage reservoir, like the Havant Thicket Reservoir, and build 3 more of those, that would provide a lasting legacy for society. And I think better value for money and potentially environmental benefits. A lot of the reservoirs that were sort of built 50, 60 years ago are now designated as SSSIs for the wildlife interest, which just goes to show their potential. So the question is, you know, if we need effluent recycling, do we need it now? And I think there's a real concern when you look at the detail of the plan, which I know most people won't do, that Southern Water are actually hyping up the demand deficit by taking over precautionary assumptions, and that drives up the forecast demand very significantly and helps them justify these more expensive and energy hungry schemes, which require huge amounts of infrastructure and which in turn make them more profit. So just to give you some indications of that, their assumption on population is that there will be growth of 23% in the population by 2050. If you look at the Ofwat National Statistics Office forecast, which they also use as part of their simulations, but isn't the selected simulation, the minimum for the National Statistics Office is 6% growth, and the maximum, I put 12 there, I think it's actually 16%. I think that might be a mistake. So it's really important that we recognise that they're using much higher growth for population than the National Statistics Office have used, and also which Ofwat have said that they could use. They're also assuming very high levels of abstraction reform. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, I want them to reduce abstractions on our rivers, but it's got to be done based on science and environmental impact. And the studies that they've done, or they're doing to determine that, aren't yet complete. So to assume huge levels of abstraction reform when you know from past experience Southern Water will prevaricate against the regulators for any reform of their licenses in the short term is, I think, over precautionary. And I think they could argue for a staged reduction in their licenses, which would make a big difference to demand. There's also a suggestion that under some scenarios, they're assuming that there'll be no abstraction from some of the rivers. So that's not even in the winter. So for the Itchen and Rother, for example, they're suggesting there wouldn't be any abstraction in the winter. Well, what impact's that going to have on flooding downstream if they don't abstract? You know, flooding is going to increase with climate change and the wetter winter scenario. So surely it would be more cost effective to develop more sustainable solutions first, and only as a last resort to look to use effluent recycling when we're absolutely certain that it's needed to meet those longer term demands. So other things to think about here. We get plenty of rain in winter. If you think back to the last 2 winters, we've had deluges of rain. So surely Southern Water should be actively developing solutions which store that free natural rainfall for use in dry summers. Only 1% of water in the UK actually gets captured. If we lived anywhere else in the world where they were facing these sorts of problems, they would actually be capturing more of that rain for use, and that's what we need to do. It's not a sustainable solution, especially when it's not even in the area of Hampshire where the water is needed. The water demand is actually in Winchester and Southampton. We've got plenty in this area. And so that means they have to build this 40-kilometre pipeline, which has huge energy and carbon costs to build and to operate. Based on Southern Water's data, we've estimated that the cost just for energy alone to customers is going to be more than £3 million a year for something that was actually selected as a drought resource but has to operate 365 days a year. Energy security is a major concern in the UK. So the companies choosing to develop these energy intensive solutions makes no sense for energy security when there are other solutions that don't require that huge amount of energy. There's a significant impact on the environment from the 40-kilometre pipeline that goes from the proper ports downhill all the way to Otterbourne with 4 river crossings, including crossing the Itchen and the Mearn, pipeline washouts, cutting through hundreds of fields and hedgerows. And each of these schemes are going to have long pipelines, some longer than others. I think this one's the longest, probably at 40 kilometres, but I guess the Horsham one's going to be quite long as well. There's going to be a huge carbon impact for 60 years. Which is contrary to Southern Water's commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030. How can you commit to be carbon neutral by 2030 and then choose the scheme that actually has the worst carbon and CO2 emissions of all the schemes that you've looked at in terms of embedded carbon and operating carbon? We went to see the restricted documents at Southern Water's HQ, which includes the environmental assessments and also the options appraisal. And the OPEX costs, so that's the operational costs for this Hampshire scheme, are actually equivalent to that of tankering from Norway. And you know, we all appreciate just how environmentally unfriendly tankering from Norway would be. So effluent recycling, in my view, works against climate change and is bad for the planet, and we need to look for better solutions. There's an increased risk of pollution to the reservoir, say from the plant, but also to the streams and the marine environment that we've already explained. And given their track record, there's not a lot of trust in Southern Water to operate this new technology to the UK for effluent recycling. It's a very expensive solution, which is not supported by customers. In the 2022 consultation, 48% of people didn't support the Havant scheme, yet Southern Water are pressing ahead and saying still that they're listening to their customers. Customers indicated they'd prefer more natural solutions like aquifer storage and reservoirs, yet they're hardly mentioned in the plan, and we'll come on to those later. So it's very hard to believe that this expensive scheme to build and operate will actually provide best value for customers or the environment. There's been a totally inadequate public consultation on the alternative options and consumer acceptability when Southern Water rejected in 2021 Fawley desalination because they realised they couldn't get the consents to discharge the reject water, the brine, into Southampton Water. They then hopped on to this scheme without doing a full options appraisal and without doing a statutory consultation, which is required by law. And they certainly haven't consulted with all of their customers to find out if there is customer acceptability of these schemes. Instead, they're working on focus groups where they bring a focus group in, they ask them what they think about this. perhaps 50% of the people say they're not very supportive of it, but then tell them all about how wonderful it is, and then they ask them again and get the answer, well, it's probably okay, isn't it? And that's what they're reporting back to Ofwat. The community are really concerned that there are cheaper, more sustainable options, and they're not being proactively investigated, which is leaving effluent recycling as the only option that's left in their plan. And just to reiterate, we get plenty of rainwater in this part of the world. Why are we not finding ways to capture and store it? As a minimum, they should be looking at a twin track approach with a development of effluent recycling as part of their medium to long-term plan, but actually looking at sustainable options as their short-term plan to address the need. You might have seen some posters or Facebook posts from members of the local community about concerns about drinking the water. From my point of view, I think it's been demonstrated in other countries that you can do this. The question is, I think, for most people, whether or not they trust people to do this, or whether or not people will reject tap water and turn to bottled water because they don't trust Southern water. And that's a particular concern because the water will taste different. It's going to come from a reservoir. Most people will be used to drinking either spring water or river water. And even from the reservoir, this water would have tasted different. And so if people tasted the water and it's different, and they know it's coming from the reservoir and it's spring fed, they'll just be thinking, oh, that's the water that I normally drink anyway. If they think about the water tasting different and thinking, oh, actually, that's coming from Southern Water's recycling plant, is that going to have psychological impacts in terms of driving them away from drinking tap water? And the last thing we need to do in this country is to drive people away from tap water because of all the environmental impact of manufacturing and transporting huge amounts of bottles, and also then obviously the bottle waste mountain that's actually produced. So if they're going to move forward with this scheme, we really think there needs to be more discussion with customers about its acceptability. So just looking at the options for a potentially better way forward, we need to look at the climate change patterns and what's going to happen to the climate. And that's predicting that we're going to get more wetter winters and drier summers. And this will put pressure on our rivers, which we need to address. So why don't we look at moving our existing abstractions down to the tidal limit to protect the environment? If we extract from the rivers at the tidal limit, we restore the natural flows. And so the river is getting whatever nature gives it. Why don't we move the existing boreholes further down the catchment so they're closer to the coast, again, so that they have less impact on our rivers and the environment? And there are other springs that come out along the coast. We should be investigating capturing more water from our coastal springs. Another key thing that we should look at in this area is we've got lots of aquifers. Not all of them are suitable, but many of them are confined, which means if you put water in, it can't escape, it just stays there. These kind of confined aquifers are used all around the world for storage in areas like California. Southern Water have identified 12 potential schemes that we found in their restricted documents, but they've parked all of them until 2020. Some of those are in Sussex, some on the Isle of Wight, many of them are in Hampshire. So why aren't we looking at those schemes first and assessing what yield they could produce in dry summers and developing those schemes, which would be a hell of a lot cheaper and more environmentally friendly than effluent recycling? Then we come on to reservoirs. Reservoirs aren't always popular in the areas they're being built, but in Hampshire, they're not looking at developing any new reservoir projects, despite the fact that we know we're going to be getting wetter winters and drier summers. So there's an opportunity here for storage. People will probably be very twitchy about the Itchenham test, but why not the River Hamble and the Wallington? Just taking water in winter when there's an excess and storing it in reservoirs. And why aren't we looking at planning that? Their plan goes to 2075, and there's not a mention of a new reservoir in Hampshire. In West Sussex, they're proposing in 2040 now to have a River Ada offline reservoir. But again, why aren't they prioritising that and trying to bring that forward and looking for other solutions for storage in West Sussex? Not sure about the Isle of Wight, the potential there, but it really should be looked at. We need much more ambitious targets for reducing leakage. Currently, 90% of all the water that goes into the distribution system for Southern Water is leaked. That's 100 million litres a day. Southern Water's target is to reduce that by just 53% by 2050. 2050, that's 25 years away, and we're still going to be leaking that 50 million litres a day. I mean, that's just not acceptable. We've worked with a local industry expert on leakage, and that's been his career, effectively working in leakage. And he says the company should be striving for 70% by 2050. That would be a massive reduction and reduce the need for these effluent recycling schemes. We need to drastically increase the rate of mains replacement. At the moment, Southern Water's track record is that a main is expected to last 1,000 years based on their rate of replacement. Well, a main is only designed to last for about 100 and 120 years at best, depending on the materials they use. So why aren't they looking to speed up their program for mains replacement? We had a look at what they've got in their plan going forward. And in 2026, they're only planning to replace 20 kilometres of main a year. That only increases to 100 kilometres by 2030 and to 200 kilometres by 2035. Yet from that period onward, they're indicating they can do 1,000 kilometres of main a year. So why aren't they striving to speed up that process, replace more of their mains and get that leakage under control? They're never going to get leakage under control until they can replace their mains and bring them up to date. If we just look at one of those examples of moving abstractions to the tidal limit, and we pick the Itchen as their sort of iconic stream that they always refer to in their publicity. If you look at where Otterbourne is at the top there, that's roughly where their abstraction works is. And all of the white dots are 12 kilometres of river that are impacted by that abstraction. So why 10 years ago, when we all started getting concerned about the Itchen and they were taken to court to reduce their abstractions about 5 years ago, why didn't they move their abstraction to the tidal limit then and protect 12 kilometres of the stream, restoring natural flows to that length of stream? That's 7.5 miles of stream that they could have protected. And it would have also protected the Itchen navigation, which runs alongside, and other ancillary channels. Restoring natural flow to the upper catchment would provide an immediate benefit to the geomorphology and ecology of the whole freshwater catchment, allowing the river to recover really rapidly. And the same amount of freshwater would still be coming out into the estuary because you wouldn't take any more water. So there shouldn't be any adverse impact on the estuary. In fact, there's a former MD of Southern Water who's very, very opposed to effluent recycling. And he's looked at a calculation for the whole of the southeast of England, which shows what water was being discharged into our estuaries in 1976. And he's found that even at 1976 levels, if we just moved all of our abstractions to the tidal limit, we would have enough water to supply the whole of the southeast. And then you could still introduce licence for reform to allow abstractions to be reduced. To basically allow more sustainable solutions to come on board and then reduce the abstractions on rivers even further. Why don't we look at aquifer storage? So if we look at the box on the left-hand side, people might not know what a confined aquifer means. So basically it means that the aquifer, which is the blue box, would be the chalk or the green sands in this area. This is where we currently get a lot of our water from, but where it's overlain by significant depths of clay, where the water isn't discharging into rivers, these are called confined aquifers. And what you can do is and they're doing it all over the world, including in California. In fact, in California, some of the recycled water is actually being discharged into aquifers in this way instead of rivers and reservoirs. So you inject your winter water into the aquifer, you leave it there for the next 3 or 4 years until you have a drought. And then instead of abstracting more water from the rivers during a drought, you abstract more water from the aquifers where you've put this water to store. There's minimum infrastructure needed, so there's very little profit in this for the water companies because there aren't big pumping stations and plants and pipelines to build, and there's no evaporational losses. And potentially there could even be some benefits to the environment. There's only one managed aquifer storage scheme that's proposed in Southern Water's plan. That's what they call the TEST MARS scheme, MARS standing for Managed Aquifer Recharge. And that's due to be brought in 2035 to 36 on the river test area. Southern Water already own the land. We know the confined aquifer is really deep, about 250 metres down. The plan is to take excess water from the river in the winter, treat it in the water treatment works, which is already there, then store the water underground, and then wait for a dry summer and then abstract it and put it back through the treatment works when there's low flows. So a really, really simple solution that only requires 4 boreholes and a pipe connection to the existing treatment works. It's been assessed already as having no likely impact on the river test in terms of the environmental assessment and the HABS regs assessment. And their 2022 report indicated the scheme could be investigated and developed within 6 years and could produce a yield between 5 and 15 megalitres a day. But in their latest plan, they suddenly backtracked on that. Nothing's changed, but they're now saying they need 10 years to think about it and develop it, and it might only produce 5.5 megalitres a day. And I would challenge them to say, I think you're just being over precautionary there. But even if it can only produce 5.5 megalitres a day, that's 5.5 megalitres of recycled effluent you don't have to use, which is a benefit to the environment and the customers in terms of cost. They've already done a trial in Dorset of the chalk, and they found that they could successfully store this in the chalk in Dorset. So why not in Hampshire or on the Isle of Wight or in Sussex? How do we drive the right behaviour from our companies? The Southern Water Plan won't fix the problem being created by current abstraction, because they're only looking to fix the problem in a drought. So Southern Water will continue to abstract as much water as they can from our rivers and groundwater all of the time, because that's cheaper for them to do. What we need to do is amend the abstraction licences in sensitive areas to encourage the right behaviour, allow more water to be taken in winter and less in the summer, and that would encourage Southern Waters to investigate and develop more sustainable, cheaper winter storage solutions. We need the government to take urgent actions too. We need them to bring forward changes to the building regulations from 2060 to 2040. We need them to change the standards for products that use waters like dishwashers and bring that forward to 2030, not 2040. We need the government to set more challenging targets for leakage, because they currently propose only 50% by 2050, and we should be encouraging companies to strive for 70%. And we need to develop variable tariffs so that the more people water use, the more they have to pay. And we fundamentally need to change the water industry funding mechanism so that Southern Water and other companies don't drive towards infrastructure solutions from which they can make the most profit, and ignore things like mains renewal, which they can't make a profit from because that's maintenance. We're currently incentivising the wrong behaviour, and we need to change that. We need to look at more sustainable options, and as a minimum, we need a twin track approach. So we've got about 5 minutes left because I started a little bit late. So I'll just quickly talk about the plan. After their last plan was rejected in 2023, following strong public opposition and objections from regulators, Southern Water were told to review the options again. But instead, they've just recycled their old plan and tried to plug the gap with tankering from Norway. That's leaving the regulators with a stark choice of let them carry on abstracting from the River Itchen and Test, or do what we all think is mad and tanker in water from Norway. 45 megalitres a day, that's 18 Olympic-sized swimming pools a day coming in from Norway. They're putting all their eggs in one basket, and what we need to do is step back and take a whole new approach to develop sustainable water supplies that work with climate change, moving abstractions and doing more water storage. Southern Water are taking us down the wrong path. Tankering is a bit of a nightmare, really. I'll just flick through this really quickly, but they're planning really to bring into Southampton docks a tanker a day on 8 tanker turnaround. There might not even be a dock available with only 6 weeks notice of a drought. The water's got a really low pH, and it needs to be remineralised before it can go into our supply system. So they're planning to put it into a lake at the River Test before it goes through treatment and into our supplies. They're planning a pipe along the banks of the River Test. What ecological damage is that going to do? And what happens if that pipe leaks with this low pH water in it? What sort of ecological impact is that going to have on fish and other species if there's a leak or burst? The carbon and energy footprint for this is huge. The risk of importing non-native species to the River Test is large. Southern Water themselves rejected this option, and we don't understand why it's back on the table. We definitely need a more sustainable solution. So what we need to do is encourage you to respond to the consultation. This time round, your response goes direct to DEFRA, and they can reject or require changes to the plan. So it's really important we let DEFRA know what we think. DEFRA, if they approve the plan unchanged, will be effectively agreeing the need for effluent recycling, which is like agreeing to have a housing in a local plan. Once the need is established, there won't be any stopping Southern Water. There won't be a planning application for the Hampshire scheme. It will be decided by the Secretary of State, because Southern Water got the Secretary of State to agree this is a national significant infrastructure project, even though it didn't meet the criteria. So they'll submit a development consent order in 2026, and that will only go for comment to the local authorities and communities. The decision will rest with the Secretary of State. This is a once in a generation opportunity to ensure the environment is put before profit and that sustainable solutions are selected and developed now. And that's what we need you to play your part in. So I would urge you to have a look at the community website that we've provided the links for here, and have a look at the concerns that we've set out in a bit more detail than I've been able to do today. There's one page that sets out 40 key concerns. And what we'd really like you to do is to respond to the DEFRA by either email or letter, and pick out those concerns that are most important to you, highlight those to DEFRA and press them to look at more sustainable solutions, and tell them what those solutions are that you want them to look at. Copy your email to your MP. We need to get MPs engaged here. And please tell your family and friends and everybody about the consultation. We need to get this out as widely as possible, because the consultation ends on the 4th of December. So that is the end, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Tracey. That was such a marathon and so much information in there. It is quite amazing. As I said earlier, if you have a question, please would you put up your hand, and I will try and take you in the order that they come in. But while I'm waiting for questions, I've got one for you, Tracey. You were talking about reservoirs and why haven't they made plans for more reservoirs? Well, I know you're involved in the development of the Havant reservoir. How is there room for more reservoirs? How easy is it to get the land for it and to actually establish the need for one?
If you actually look at the Havant Thicket Reservoir, in the 1960s, they identified over 80 sites where they could build a reservoir. Obviously, the criteria that you looked at from an environmental perspective back in the 60s perhaps weren't as rigid as we would look at now. So, for example, they included the ancient woodland at Southleigh Forest near Emsworth, which of course you wouldn't be allowed to cut down the ancient woodland and build a reservoir now. And it also includes some sites where they've already been developed for housing. But certainly there are schemes just in that list that were alternatives to the Havant Thicket Reservoir, where the option is still available, the land is still available. I can think of a particular scheme that was near Borehunt that took water from the River Wallington. The River Wallington floods most winters. It regularly floods houses. If you could take more water in the winter, that would help reduce the flood risk, which is only going to increase with climate change. And so for me, that would be a perfect place to look at placing another reservoir. You know, if you look at the land around the River Hamble, it's all on clay. You know, there must be sites there where they could consider developing reservoirs. So, you know, I don't know the whole of this part of the country. I don't know West Sussex and the Isle of Wight very well. But it's hard to believe that if we can find 80 sites sort of between Southampton and Chichester as alternatives for the Havant Thicket Reservoir, that there aren't alternatives in other parts of the area as well.
That's great, thank you. Philip, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, just a few comments really. That's brilliant, thank you. Remember back in the late 1990s, there was lots of ill feeling with people with bad taste from the Harden waterworks, and they often had problems with cryptosporidium. Had to put in loads and loads of chlorine and stuff. That's just a comment. There was also back then a big new pipeline laid along the River Rother from Hardham right the way up north of Midhurst, well up towards Rogate. I'm not sure where it actually rejoined the Rother, whether they put it back into the Rother, but that was like a dry weather thing, because there's so many long-standing abstraction licenses on the Rother that you know, newer ones have got more limits on them, but some of the older ones haven't. Um, Horsham Sewage Works doing fish surveys there in the late 1980s. The stacks of foam coming up like 12, 15 feet deep wall of foam. And the fish then were suffering with human hormones that were in the water. The roach were definitely confirmed having problems. So that was 1998. I think that's enough from me, but I'll come back with some more in a minute.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Tracey, I've got a question from Steve McAuliffe, who's one of our Green councillors in Arran, and he says Havant will be an NSIP, that's a National Significant Infrastructure Scheme. So does this mean that others will follow that precedent and sidestep local planning?
Yeah, it's difficult to know for certain because technically the Havant scheme, I don't think, met the NSIP requirements. So they've got it designated as a reservoir scheme at the moment under NSIP, which it quite clearly isn't. And even the Havant Thicket Reservoir was barely big enough to count as an NSIP scheme. So we had the choice of putting it down the National Infrastructure Projects or putting it through the local planning authority. And when I was at Portsmouth Water, we thought it was really important to let the local community consider the application. We'd done a lot of stakeholder engagement, and so we took the decision to take it down the local planning authority route through the local council. I understand that the way that they argued it for the Havant scheme was on the basis of the pipeline crossing six, I think it was, local authority areas, and that therefore it was going to be difficult to get a decision from all 6 local authorities in a timely manner. And that was their justification for taking it away. So if you've got a scheme, say, for example, on the Isle of Wight, which is only impacting the Isle of Wight, and it doesn't meet the national infrastructure criteria, it's difficult to see how they could justify taking it to that. But there is a worry that because these effluent recycling schemes are seen as difficult to get through planning, that the criteria for national infrastructure projects can be changed at any point, and the government can designate a category for effluent recycling. There's already one for waste, which they might be able to put it through. So it's a bit of an uncertain as to what the planning routes for the others would be, but I certainly would say there's a risk that they could end up not being with your local planning authority, but being with the Secretary of State.
Thanks. We've got a question from Alex Ford.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Tracey. That was a really great talk and really informative. I look at it from an environmental toxicology perspective, and I was just wondering, has Southern Water produced any data on what they think is the efficiency of getting rid of some of the micropollutants from the water, such as PFAS chemicals? And
the answer is no. They've certainly not made any information public. About a year ago, we did a freedom of information request because they'd set up a trial plant at Bud's Farm for microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and the UV part of the process. It didn't include the granular activated carbon. And we asked them to provide the data for what goes in and what comes out. And they refused and said that it didn't meet the criteria and they didn't have to provide it. And so we appealed, and actually literally in the last few days, we've actually received that information following our appeal. So I haven't had a chance to have a look at it yet, but it's basically giving us min, max, mean and 95 percentile for what goes in and what goes out on the range of pollutants that they tested for. So it is going to be interesting to have a look at that data. We were promised that before this consultation, they would have published their modelling as to how they felt it was going to sort of spread in the reservoir and what the impacts on the reservoir would be and downstream. But again, that data hasn't been published despite that commitment to publish it in time for this consultation. So no, they're not going out of their way to put information in the public domain. And when we went to see the restricted documents, I produced a table which summarised quite a lot of the environmental information from their sort of key facts for each scheme. And I said to them, you know, I don't see that this is confidential information. Can I put it in the public domain? And I've had 2 emails coming back to me saying, no, I can't. And I've challenged them and said, why isn't it, you know, what is it about this information that makes it security confidential? And I've asked twice and I still haven't had an answer. But at the moment, I'm not allowed to put that information in the public domain. But we'll have a look at the data that's come in now under this Freedom of Information request, and we'll consider what we do with that and whether or not we think it's helpful to put it in the public domain.
What I've noticed, obviously, some of the flagship places around the world where they have the water recycling is Singapore and perhaps Israel. And from what I can gather, there's quite a lot of new studies that are coming out where they've got quite high levels of PFAS in the population, and health effects that correlate with that PFAS as well. And I just don't know whether anybody's got a handle on it yet. So I don't know whether Southern Water has, and I don't think anybody has got a handle yet on how good these are with these newer compounds that we're really only now just starting to worry about.
Well, I think this is part of the problem, isn't it? Is that all the time our knowledge of contaminants is increasing, and we're finding new contaminants in the environment to test for. So, and remembering one of the things I didn't mention about the risks to the reservoir is that when they test the water that's being discharged to the reservoir as it comes out of the plant, they'll largely be using what we call surrogate parameters. So things like, you know, turbidity and pH and biological oxygen demand, which give you an indication of certain types of contaminants and whether or not that they're in the water. And if it passes those, then obviously the water will be allowed to pass into the reservoir. And it'll only be like something like once a month under the discharge consent condition for the reservoir that they'll actually be asked to do a broader range of tests. And that's not a test for everything. That's just a test then for your things like, you know, solvents and some of your endocrine disruptors and these sort of things that they're required to test for in drinking water. And so, you know, 28 days later, when these results come back from the lab and they find that they've potentially failed those tests, well, you're not going to be taking the water back from the reservoir, are you? It's just not going to be practical. And so I think that's one of the big worries is the lack of trust in Southern Water to be able to operate this really complex plant. And we know it is really complex. There was a chap, I did a talk last week or so in Horndean, and a chap came up to me afterwards who'd worked for a local soft drinks company who manufacture soft drinks in this area. And he said, oh, we tried to use reverse osmosis and this kind of advanced technology that Southern Water are talking about using for the waste from our soft drinks manufacture before we put it into the sewers and environment. And what we found was that even though we had, you know, good chemists and things working the plant, trying to keep it in balance and everything, that the membranes would break down quite readily, and the membranes are hugely expensive to replace. And in the end, we just found it wasn't practical and cost effective to operate the plant, even on a small industrial scale. So Thames have had major problems with their desalination plant. We've been told it's out of operation more than it's in operation. So it really is a difficult technology to control. Where they're using it in Singapore, for example, they're not using it because they don't get enough rain. They're using it because they haven't got enough space for storage. And at the moment, they take their water from Malaysia, which as a country, if you rely on another country for your water supply, that's not very good. And they've had some major problems in their past with water supply, which has basically forced them to go down a different route, and they've selected effluent recycling. But actually, when you look at their website, very, very little of that water goes into public supply to a reservoir. That only happens under very dry conditions. The majority of the water goes into a separate network, which is used by industrial blue chip companies for their manufacturing processes. So although that's held up as a good example of where it's successfully used, actually it's not a comparable example because it's going to industry. And actually, again, if you look at the reports in Singapore, they've now got a massive plastic bottle mountain. You know, whether that's linked or not, I can't be 100% sure. But certainly in California, when they did studies originally for effluent recycling, the population weren't prepared to accept effluent recycling for their drinking water. They then had a triple-year drought and their reservoirs went pretty much dry. And so there was an acceptance in the community that they needed, with a drying climate, in such an extreme drought area to actually have effluent recycling. They then did some follow-up research a few years later, and they asked people about effluent recycling again, and the sort of general response seemed to be, yeah, it's fine, we're happy with it, it's okay. And then they said, oh, that's good. And they went, yeah, but we don't drink it. So, even in these examples that are being held up, you find papers that are published that suggest that people have turned to bottled water. So I'm not saying that that's everybody, but given the level of trust there is in Southern Water at the moment in this area, you know, can they actually convince people that they can do this safely? You know, technically it's possible, you know, but it's possible for them to do more than they do in terms of preventing pollution incidents at the moment, and they still happen. So I think it is a genuine concern that the local community hold.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Alex. I've got 3 questions, Tracey, that are pretty much linked, I believe. Starting with Isabel has asked, it sounds as if a lot of legislation needs changing to avoid things like profiteering. What are the chances of government doing this? And then Chris has asked, linked, can't Ofwat or an independent government agency make Southern Water follow a more sensible path? Not a great success rate of Ofwat doing anything. And then Deborah as well has asked, linked, I am struggling to understand the mechanism by which Southern Water can make profit from commissioning undertaking infrastructure work, probably linked to the fact that they've profited massively already and have given all their dividends to shareholders. So do you need me to go over those again?
No. So about how they make a profit basically is that under the current Ofwat funding mechanism, which could be changed because it's only guidance, it's not in law, so it'd be relatively easy for the government to require changes to drive a different behaviour. The companies are allowed, I wrote it down, just let me find my little note on this. A 3.72% guaranteed return on any capital investment is the latest Ofwat determination for the Southern Water, and I think generally for the industry. So basically everything that they build that's, you know, concrete, brick, pipe, new pipe that is, they can make a 3.72% return on, and then over and above that, quite a lot of the financing of these companies is actually done by people that are in the background of their ownership. So effectively, they're funding the debt, and obviously the debt has to be paid for as well. So if you're an owner of a water company, you can make your money twice because you get to make the guaranteed return on your investment for any new infrastructure, but you also get a return on the debt that you invest in for the company. And Southern Water have had some high publicity articles in the last week about the fact they've been really struggling to fund their debt and get the loans that they need. And so as a result of that, the cost of their debt is now increased massively. There was figures going around of 10%, don't quote me on it, it's just what's been read in the press. And so that means customers are having to service that debt now because even the financial institutes don't trust Southern Water to give them the sort of return on their debt because of what's happening with Thames and things as well. So that's the way they manage to make a profit. They get a profit on the infrastructure that they build, and they get a profit effectively from the debt. And the companies are now very debt-led by their new investors. That wasn't the case when the industry's first privatised. But obviously, if you privatise an industry, the first thing that they do is try and work out how to make a profit because that's what's driving their shareholders. And so that's what has happened over the years. It's been realised that you effectively can make money through the debt, and so we've now got an industry that's very, very heavily laden with debt, and that's a real problem now that we need big amounts of investment. And the problem is the sort of thing that we're talking about investing in here in sort of reducing leakage and mains renewal, because it's existing infrastructure that effectively they're repairing or replacing, that counts as maintenance, and they're not allowed to make the profit on that. So they can just charge customers for that. So there's not much benefit to them in actually having a big program of mains renewal, other than that it's the right thing to do. And if you look at something like the Test Aquifer scheme that I was talking about, putting 5 boreholes into the ground and a short section of pipe to the Testwood treatment works, again, there's no profit to be had in that. So why would you want to promote that? In fact, they had pushed it right back to 2042. And a lot of us commented that, you know, that it was ridiculous and it should be brought forward as a very sensible scheme to help with drought on the Test and the Itchen. And they've now brought it forward to 2035 and said it's going to take 10 years to develop. Well, I'm really sceptical about that because their earlier reports said it should only take 6 years. I thought that was too long to investigate some boreholes and some pumping trials. So why couldn't they start that in 2024 and have it ready by 2030? And I think it's been pushed back to 2035 because any schemes that they bring forward before 2035 actually potentially push back when effluent recycling is needed. And so they don't want schemes like improved leakage and improved mains renewal and sustainable storage solutions to come forward before 2035 and produce their profit-making effluent recycling schemes further down the line.
Right, Tracey, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there because we really have just got 1 minute left. So I want to thank you very much. That really has been a sterling performance. I don't know how you managed to keep going, and you've got so much detailed knowledge, and it's just amazing. So I'm really hoping that everybody will respond to the consultation, that they will use the information they heard tonight. I know we've got at least one comment where somebody doesn't agree with you, but I think, and obviously there are alternative opinions, but you've given us so much food for thought. And
can I just say one thing? What I was going to do, if it's okay, is if I make a PDF of my presentation and send it to you, anyone that's booked online, hopefully you'll have their email address for. And if we could cascade the slides so that people have got a bit more time to sort of think over them, because it was a bit of a rush through, especially towards the end, to try and get in what we wanted. And with that, I can share the link so that people can find more information on the community website and also the email address that I've got on the screen now for DEFRA. So is that okay if I share those with you tomorrow and you cascade them?
We'll certainly do that, and we'll share it with the recording of this as well, so that if people want to go over it again, they get the opportunity to do so. So thank you very much, Tracey.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. That's much appreciated.
And thank you very much for everybody for attending. Bye-bye.